My name is Linda Haas. I am very interested in history. I'm a trustee on the Jackson County, Michigan Historical Society. And also I was named the city historian by the Jackson City Council. So history is a real passion for me. And today I'm in Jackson's train depot, which is part of an Underground Railroad corridor that played a significant role in the overall Underground Railroad back in the 1840s and the 1850s. This property that we're in right now, this very property, was the eastern end of an Underground Railroad corridor. The western end of it was 1.5 miles west of here, a passenger depot at the time. At the time, this was a freight depot. So we're going back to 1840s, and both ends of the corridor served in the Underground Railroad. Freedom seekers with tickets, or who could afford tickets, would get on board the train at the passenger depot, and one of the advantages to that is that they could ride comfortably in on nice seats, but they risked publicity because they were highly visible. Most freedom seekers did not enter by way of the passenger depot. They entered by way of the freight depot, which was located here on this very property. And they were boarded on the train by participating abolitionists who would package them secretly in boxes, in crates, load them on the train, headed for Detroit. From Detroit, then they would go on to Canada. But sometimes they would just hang around the freight depot, hope to find an open door, slip in one of the cars, hide behind some of the crates, and hitch a ride to Detroit, and from Detroit again go on to Canada. So this end probably got the more use in the Underground Railroad because it was free. They didn't have to pay for a ticket, and they could be under the radar, not seen, not heard, unlike the passenger depot. One of the more intriguing stories is of freedom seekers who did access the passenger depot in 1847, and I would love to tell you that story because it has national significance. In fact, it's why this depot today is listed on the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. And this depot has a national designation. It also has a state designation. There's a state marker outside that commemorates the story I'm about to tell you. And there are 5 local historical markers inside that were researched and installed by our Jackson County, Michigan Historical Society with funding from the Field Foundation. There is a lot of confusion about what the Underground Railroad is. There's a lot of myths about it. The name itself is kind of misleading because you're thinking that it is a railroad underground just by virtue of the words that are used to describe it. It was not. It did not involve tunnels with trains moving underground. It was a system that transported freedom seekers from slave states to areas that were free, whether it be the free states in the north, whether it be Canada. Sometimes it was even Mexico, just anywhere where slavery was not. And there was a system of transportation that moved those freedom seekers to these free areas, and that is what we refer to as the Underground Railroad. It was a secretive system that existed probably in its most organized form from 1830 to the early 1860s. It was disrupted by the Civil War somewhat. So 1830s to 1860s. And it involved various modes of travel, wagon, on foot, carriage, boats, and sometimes on rare occasions, trains, which is what makes this setting so perfect as we're talking about the Underground Railroad. Among those using Jackson's Underground Railroad corridor were the Crosswhite family. And I'm standing beside the historical marker that our Historical Society installed several years ago honoring this very event that I'm about to tell you about. And it began in 1847, actually began a few years before that. Adam Crosswhite and his family were born enslaved Americans. They worked on a plantation in Kentucky. When they found out that their owner was going to sell them separately, that they couldn't stay together as a family, they devised a plan to escape with help of the Underground Railroad to come north onto free soil. One of the most ingenious ways that they hid their tracks was they dumped all their furniture in a nearby river so that the house was empty, and then they took off on the fastest horses that they could heading north. It looked to their owners that they were traveling with all their furniture lumbered down in a wagon. So the owner did not go very far in establishing checkpoints, because how fast can a wagon go when it's very heavily laden? But in reality, this was part of their plan, because they were on the fastest horses they could find, and they were already out of Kentucky by the time these checkpoints were set up. They made their way in with the help of the Underground Railroad, came through Indiana into Michigan, and finally they settled in Marshall, where there was a community of freedom seekers who were settled quite happily in Marshall. And the Crosswhites lived there for many years until their former owners tracked them to Marshall and tried to kidnap them and take them back to Kentucky. Abolitionists intervened and hid the Crosswhites until evening, and under the cover of darkness, they rode in a wagon all the way to Jackson's train depot. Interestingly, Marshall had its own train depot, but as you can imagine, checkpoints in Marshall were probably well established by the slave catchers, so they wanted to come as far as possible away from Marshall to get on the train, and Jackson is about 30 miles to the west of Marshall. They didn't want to come in the depot because they were afraid of being identified, so on a January night of 1847, they hid in the woodyard outside. And anyone from Michigan knows that being outside in January is sometimes a death sentence in and of itself, depending on how cold it is. But they spent all night outside in the woodyard, and they were told to look for a sign. When the train rolled into Jackson the next morning, if there was an abolitionist standing on the rear platform waving to them, that was a sign that they were free to get on the train, that it was safe to get on the train, that there were no slave catchers on board. If there was no abolitionists on the back steps, that meant that was a sign that slave catchers were indeed on the train. Don't get on it. And also that was another sign that the slave catchers were now in Jackson, where they were, and the odds are probably pretty good that they would have been captured. So the next morning, I'm imagining they're as cold as possible, looking for that early morning train, hearing it come into Jackson, waiting anxiously to see what would be on that rear platform of that train. Lo and behold, when the train rolled in, there was an abolitionist standing there, waving to them. They hurriedly left the woodyard, got onto the train, made it safely to Detroit, and from Detroit, they were ferried across to Canada, where they lived throughout the Civil War. Interestingly, when the Civil War was over, they came back to Michigan, to Marshall, which they now considered their home. And obviously the Civil War settled the matter of slavery. So they lived the rest of their lives in Marshall. But this historical marker tells this very dramatic story. This picture right here, which was sketched by a Spring Arbor art professor, Brianne Witt, shows the abolitionists on the rear platform, shows the Crosswhites in a very striking likeness of Adam Crosswhite loading on the train, and just explains that story, shows the two corridors. We're now on the east end. Later on, this beautiful passenger depot was built, but at the time, like I said, it was a freight depot. The passenger depot was 1.5 miles west of here. Right now, there is no remnant of that original building. Anybody that participated in the Underground Railroad was considered an agent or an activist in the system. Whether you actually conducted the slaves in a wagon, driving the wagon, whether you provided the funding for the system, whether you opened your home as a refuge for them, whether you provided food and clothing, anybody that participated or supported is considered an agent in the Underground Railroad. And this was a humanitarian system that brought together so many different people. After the Republican Party was formed in 1854, it brought together Democrats, Republicans, people without any political affiliation, the young, the old, blacks, whites, rich, poor. One of the things that inspires me even today about the Underground Railroad is it shows how different people with different backgrounds and ethnicities could come together for a cause that is greater than the sum of their differences. And I think that's something that we can take from it today. That's something we can learn today. We can find inspiration from that it is still possible to come together for a cause that's greater than the sum of our differences. The Underground Railroad embodies that, and that's one of the reasons I've been so passionately interested in this topic. And again, another reason that makes this setting so perfect to talk about the Underground Railroad. Here we are in a train station that was connected to the railroad.